I'd like to welcome students, faculty, and community members to our third speaker series of 2018. For those who don't know me, my name is Jack Sullivan, and I'm a member of the MPA class of 2018, and I'll play host for this week's policy speaker series, for which we are fortunate to have Miss Marian Campbell Jarvis here to speak with us today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous territory on which we have the privilege of meeting today. The territory sits on the homeland of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people. We're grateful to the Indigenous people of Turtle Island for welcoming us to their territory. Now, I would like to introduce an accomplished member of the Federal Public Service, Marian Campbell Jarvis. Marian currently serves as the Assistant Secretary to Cabinet for Social Development Policy, a position she's held since October of 2017. From 2013 until last year, Marian held the post of Assistant Deputy Minister, Lands and Minerals Sector at Natural Resources Canada, where she was responsible for the Geological Survey of Canada, economic and market analysis on mineral development, explosives regulation, green mining science and technology, logistical support for researchers in Canada's high Arctic, and the climate change impacts and Adaptation Canada. Prior to joining Natural Resources Canada, Marian developed strategic policy at Human Resources and Skills Development Canada, Health Canada, and the Privy Council Office. Marian holds an undergraduate degree in Canadian Studies from Carleton University and has a Master's of Public Administration from Queen's University. Marian will be speaking to us today about what societal shifts have occurred and how much they matter to Canada, and what new considerations policymakers now have to reflect upon. Marian's talk today is sure to get us thinking and evoke questions. As in the past, we'll be using Slido to ask the questions to Marian. For those unfamiliar, you can submit your questions by going to the Slido website directly or using the app on your phone. The code for today is MPA 18. Please ask questions throughout the talk, and they will show here on the screen. Also, if you don't have any questions, so take a moment to vote on others' questions you are also interested in. We'll take a few questions from the audience as well today. Without further ado, please help me in welcoming Marian Campbell Jarvis.
Thank you, Jack. Good. Well, hello, everyone. Can hear me all right, I hope? Good, testing the microphone, excellent, good. Well, thank you very much for the warm invitation. Professor Wolf, I really appreciated the opportunity to come down and maybe escape a little bit from the churn of the day-to-day and engage with all of you and to think of some thoughts. Professor Wolf gave me enough rope to hang myself by allowing me to pick the topic, and I hope it will spark some discussion among you. Certainly when I had the invitation to come, it really led me to reflect on my time here at Queen's and the MPA program and a lot of the interesting work I've been part of since, first as a policy analyst and then as an executive with the federal government. And in doing so, I apologize if I kind of go down memory lane, but it made me think about how things have changed and where we're headed and what we're all about here in Canada. So when I was here at Queen's in room 301, spent many hours there, it was just on the heels of the failed by a whisker 1995 referendum in Quebec. So perhaps after that experience, it's not really surprising that the phrase social cohesion emerged in the discourse in the late 1990s. I also recall in that kind of same era, Robert Putnam released his book with the wonderful title of Bowling Alone, and that really set out the decline in social capital and how community engagement appeared on the decline. So this little bit of reminiscing led me to think about social cohesion and what does it mean today. And of course, just for all of us to be on the same page, social cohesion really refers to the forces that bind individuals, that bond us together in a given society, our common values, civic order, attachment, that sense of belonging that I think many of us seek, and shared participation. So I'm really interested in your views, and while the sharp emphasis on national unity may ebb and flow a bit, certainly social cohesion for governments and for policymakers remains an important consideration. This sense of shared values and that we're all in it together and that we have a common narrative and one that is solid enough that it can evolve over time, yet withstand challenges from external forces, is perhaps really an element of nation building and citizenship. So I didn't want to bore you all with a talk about globalization or the pace of technology, big data, artificial intelligence, and risk being trite. Though clearly we all understand these phenomena are changing the world around us. And I'm already advancing through slides that you're not supposed to see yet. There we go. However, from the policymaker's perspective, I would invite you to consider with me, and really, if I provoke a spark or a reflection or even a disagreement, then I will be content. But I'd invite you to think about whether there are new or emerging challenges or tensions that policymakers to include today in their worldview or their analytical toolkit to ensure that we don't make more vulnerable social cohesion in Canada, either through unintended consequence or perhaps more directly. Like so many policy domains, the role of government is changing, and a shift in how we view and frame the problem is required, as well as how we get at these solutions. So that's where you fit in, Jack and your cohort. You are needed to help challenge our conventional thinking, conventional wisdom, and define the problems and how do we put solutions on the table. I am taking it as for granted, really, that a measure of social cohesion is considered a good thing, although perhaps some of you may consider that irrelevant, and that's fair game too. Maybe I did a little too much celebrating through the Canada 150 this past year, but I would like the Canadian experiment to continue to succeed. So, to take us back, not as far back as the 1990s, but over a decade ago, just to move us forward a bit, in 2007, Stuart Soroka, writing about diversity and social cohesion, put forward this insight, and I'll read it to you. The largest challenges to social cohesion in Canada remain rooted not in the attitudes, beliefs, and attachment of relative newcomers, but in the historic fault lines between the oldest nations that make up this country. So he was in effect saying that these new ideas and beliefs don't place pressure on our collective sense of common purpose, but that the Anglo-French distinctions, coupled with the isolation and struggles of colonial legacy on Indigenous people, are in fact the underlying pressures and challenges. So, 10 years later, does this still hold true today? And to what extent? Perhaps this thinking is maybe a little bit too binary for today's context. And are there other factors? Are there what I call emerging pressures within pressures? In other words, are there added dimensions and complexity to previously identified policy considerations or trends? I'd like to put forward a couple of shifts, maybe 3, to consider. So the first is diversity and gender. Broader considerations for looking at policy questions. And yes, bringing forward the colonial struggle. I'd like to speak a little bit about Indigenous reconciliation, so an opportunity and a challenge to social cohesion. And perhaps third, so I did say I wouldn't speak about the pace of technology, but I can't resist speaking about the use of technology, so maybe you'll allow me a little semantic to split hairs there. But that's really helping us to understand our changing context. So first, on diversity and gender. Just a couple of statistics here. So it's well acknowledged that the composition of the Canadian population is becoming diverse. We all know that. And this diversity is manifested in different ways: ethnicity, culture, religion, language, and changes in aging. You can see in this slide the distribution of foreign-born population from 1871 to 2036. And it's quite dramatic. And I think we all know this intuitively, but when you really see it set out in these kind of bar lines, the different regions of the country that are sources of immigration to Canada has really shifted quite dramatically over time. On this second slide, Again, something we all know, the kind of changing face of Canada, some might say. This slide sets out the proportion, really 1 in 3 Canadians by 2036, and we're already far past that in some regions and cities in the country, will really change. So sociologist Jeffrey Wright commented that increased diversity has the potential to influence society in 2 ways. Ethno-racial diversity in particular can affect the sense of fairness and inclusion in a society if it produces inequality. Diversity can also call into question common values, commitments, and social relations among groups and individuals, and we're seeing that playing out in many places around the world right now. So diversity, therefore, has the potential to strengthen or to weaken social cohesion. So while the source countries are changing in Canada, and there are a far greater number of source countries than ever before, population settlement in Canada is also worth noting. We can see here that the bulk of immigrant destinations is centered in Canada's largest cities, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. But even in other parts of the country are attracting immigrants. So Atlantic Canada, for example, long viewed by outbound immigration, is attracting immigrants as well. And although it's quite stark, it's almost like 400% increase, actually. So that's kind of interesting. So Statistics Canada colleagues have undertaken some projections, and I wanted to share that with you. Based on all of the different projection scenarios, the graphic distribution of immigrants in various regions in 2036 is actually going to be quite similar to the 2011 graph there on your right. The vast majority, upwards of 90%, will continue to live in a census metropolitan area. The 3 primary areas of residence are going to remain Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. And according to all of these scenarios for projections, more than 1 in 2 people in 2036 will be the immigrant or the child of an immigrant in Toronto and Vancouver. The results of the projections show that the proportion of the working age population who belong to visible minority group will increase in all areas of the country as well. This proportion will surpass 40% in Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, Edmonton, Calgary, Winnipeg, and Abbotsford Mission in BC. And really, this simply means that the population in cities are likely to become increasingly more diverse, while in rural and remote areas of Canada, and I think we all know, you don't have to go too far north to be in rural and remote areas of Canada, will remain more unchanged. So will this exacerbate rural and urban differences? And if so, in what ways? And quite frankly, will it matter? How to ensure that growing diversity reinforces cohesion rather than detracts from it? In cities, this diversity clearly has an economic value, the broadening of competencies of different perspectives for the labor market and generating innovation. So the larger question is, how do we build social cohesion as a driving force to maximize Canada's potential in an economic and very competitive changing world? So far, my comments on diversity have stemmed from an immigration-based, perhaps more traditional way of talking about diversity, really highlighting racial, ethnic, cultural diversity. And I would say, too, if you were to probe this data more deeply, greater religious diversity would also be revealed. So a word on gender, and as I was reading the newspaper coming down here today, couldn't help but notice on the front page that the Senate passed legislation to render Canada's national anthem gender neutral, so it's certainly very topical. GBA analysis has been undertaken for decades in looking at the possible impacts of various groups of men and women in government programs and policies. It was undertaken because there was a recognition of potential blind spots on gender and intersectional elements that may be seen to have a policy impact play out differently across cohorts. So obviously, seniors and retirement income is an area that has become more responsive as a result. Today, GBA analysis is now called GBA+, and this analysis has become far more sophisticated, taking into account questions about disability and accessibility and mental health. Considerations, for example, that bring together a broader definition of diversity than simply one speaking about immigration and men and women. One of my current responsibilities is for the LGBTQ2 Secretariat. This secretariat is helping to bring into the mainstream questions about sexual identity and gender considerations for policymaking. Clearly, an objective is to advance gender equality and to end discrimination. A secretariat such as this would be unheard of a decade ago, and I think perhaps even 5 years ago. How do problems look different or have different solutions if you apply different lenses? For example, we know that LGBTQ2 youth are overrepresented in the homeless youth population. It has been estimated that approximately 25 to 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ2. In looking at the causes of these risk factors of homelessness and how they can be mitigated, could, for example, bringing an LGBT lens more fully equip policymakers to address homelessness? So these intersectional questions. What does a broad gender lens mean for social cohesion? Will it help to tackle discrimination and thereby increase social cohesion? I've identified Indigenous reconciliation as a factor that has greater emphasis presently for social cohesion. It's long been noted that coming to terms with the past and the legacy of today, for example, from residential schools, would increase social cohesion in Canada, and it's certainly a priority of the current government. There's far more emphasis and attention being put on Indigenous issues. Let's just take a look at the population figures. What really comes out from this data is that Indigenous people are growing more rapidly, the population size, and it's a far younger cohort than the rest of the Canadian average. This slide is really, really interesting, or at least I find it interesting. We can see here that there's quite a social cohesion challenge for policymakers from this slide, because you can see the support is different across some of the questions here. I think most people, rightly, are troubled by the poor living conditions, the boiled water advisories, the social traumas visited on Canada's Indigenous people. However, you can see here that support on this public opinion survey decreases markedly when looking at lands and resources. So if you can't quite read the font because it's kind of a purpley color, the top two bars are showing support for increasing funding for education and for funding for reserves on drinking water advisories. Whereas you move down at the very end, it's for settling outstanding land claims, regardless of the costs that this may incur. And the second bar from the bottom is about access to natural resources and land. So what this slide really reveals is Canadians are quite generous in their thinking of funding for social supports, but are concerned, presumably, about loss of economic activity and ownership of resources. This could actually, in effect, reinforce the status quo for Indigenous peoples if Indigenous communities do not have access to economic levers. At the other end of the spectrum, there is clearly an investor climate consideration with businesses seeking certainty for land access. Navigating this and maintaining social cohesion and achieving greater social cohesion is a key area of importance. One possible social cohesion opportunity is also set out in this data, and it's somewhere right in the middle, where Canadians expressing their support for Indigenous culture and language. Because here, there may be the foundation to promote cultural identity and therefore healing and reconciliation. And that's because languages, as many of us know, connect us to our heritage and thereby bring a sense of that belonging that's so important in social cohesion and self-worth. There are several studies documenting the positive impacts of learning in one's mother tongue and connecting to cultural heritage through language in terms of social and educational outcomes. I certainly saw this when I was the ADM responsible for mining. I didn't know that the dirt ministries could be actually quite so fascinating. But really, they are at the intersect point of social, economic, environmental, Canada's place in the world, and tremendous federal-provincial relations. And here you can see the tension and the friction on social cohesion. So for example, pipelines, dare I say, there's sort of a geographic tension of social cohesion. And often the questions there are framed, as we're seeing in the newspapers today with Premier Notley, speaking about the benefits from one region and another region, assuming the risks. In mining, the geographic base is far more centered. It doesn't transcend a broad area. And there you still see some of the social cohesion tensions that can play out between who's going to maximize the benefits and who's going to mitigate the risks. And in many of these questions, skipping ahead already, in many of these questions, you can see that the tension's playing out and touching on Indigenous reconciliation as well. I want to shift to the third, so that we have some time to engage and engage in Slido, which is a wonderful segue into kind of the role of social media. We can really see how technology is changing how people think. And I want to share just a little personal anecdote, very micro, that illustrates this. It's a Saturday morning, and I'd raced off to the Loblaws to pick up groceries. And of course, when I got to the grocery store, I realized the list that I had jotted things down throughout the week was left at home. However, I did have handy cell phone, so phoned home. My daughter answered, and I said, I forgot the list on the fridge. Can you remind me what's on the fridge? And there was sort of this pause, and I thought, oh, well, she's somewhere in the house and coming down to the kitchen. And then I said, hello, are you still there? And she said, I did. And I said, what? And she said, I just sent it to you. And some of you in this room will get this, and some of you will not get what I'm speaking about. But really, the point was, the way I was thinking about things, I was kind of waiting for her to recite the list to me, or maybe type it all in her phone and text it to me. But she just, as many of you do, snapped a picture and sent it to me. And I felt very old. But I think many of you can kind of relate that the way we use technology and the way we think about situations is shifting. So that's my grocery list example, and my 14-year-old daughter. But for social cohesion, what does this mean? How and where populations get their information is an important factor for policymaking. So clearly, and I hope you can kind of see these charts, the social media has an impact on where and how Canadians are accessing their news. And it also has impacted on what is going to be the news. So there's, I think what we're really seeing is there's quite a bit of tailoring to news. So you may be reading the news or accessing your news in a very personalized way. And we see this, the statistics here show that people are moving away from traditional sources of news to the internet and social networking sites for their information. However, the slides also show that people seem to trust the traditional news sources even though they use them less. And many of these sources are not necessarily Canadian, that you can see. So in the policy context, the speed at which information can be disseminated, the variety of sources which people use to access their information, and the reach of that information have all shifted the way in which people engage in a particular policy issue. So no longer are we all reading the same article written by the same editorial bias or the same perspective. We are, in fact, accessing a far wider range of information from infinitely more sources, including those tailored specially, even if you didn't realize it, by algorithms from sites such as Facebook. On one hand, you can see the rallying power of social media to coalesce a population around an issue. Take the Arab Spring or demonstrations recently in Iran. But with personalization people are less likely to be exposed to other points of view. And through this tailoring, may in fact have their viewpoints reinforced because you read things that you agree with and reinforces that you're right. We'd like that. The sense of community, therefore, may not be geographic, but may having different communities of interest. So what does that mean for social cohesion in Canada? You know, there may not be something necessarily here for policymakers to do, but in looking at this from a social cohesion perspective, there may be new fault lines and pressures for governments. Certainly having authoritative information, investing in sciences and evidence-based information may have ever more import. There may be opportunities too. The government's emphasis on a progressive trade agenda, for example, could be seen as much about exporting a social cohesion perspective as an economic agenda. I do want to leave time here for discussion, and I hope I presented a smattering of considerations for you to reflect on and to think about. And I want to end here with some questions about what perspectives and tools might we need to adapt to changing circumstances? Are there different policy considerations from a decade or two ago on which we need to focus to strengthen social cohesion in Canada? And so what do you think are Canada's biggest social cohesion challenges, and what role can governments play in improving social cohesion? Thank you very much.